an honor to be here. I'd like to thank everybody who made this possible. Say some things in conjunction with things that have already been said. I want to talk theoretically and politically. I want to talk about something that needs to be done that's not making any progress, not only environmentally, but politically. Politically, I want to talk about alliance politics. We need to unite the left and the animal liberation movement and the earth liberation movements. I just want you to know before I speak, I come from the left. My background's from the left. And I evolved into an animal liberationist, or what I'll call a total liberationist. So when I am critical of the left, I know what I'm talking about. When I'm critical of the vegan community, I know what I'm talking about from experience and from reading and theory. So I want to say first that the good news is we're winning many battles. Battles for ecology, for peace, for democracy, liberation, rights of all beings on the planet. But we're losing the war. We're losing the war against corporate capital, against greed, against the domination of the IMF, against the loss of species, linguistically, culturally, biologically. We're losing the war, and we're losing ground. So we have to recognize this, that whatever we're doing, we're not doing enough. We've had 3 or 4 decades of strong environmental and animal liberation movement activity. The movement for the human rights and social justice, of course, goes back centuries. And yet we're losing ground. So this means either we're doing something completely wrong, or we've got some good ideas and we need to radicalize everything we're thinking and everything we're doing. Look at the signs of ecological distress. They're everywhere. This planet is screaming. It's screaming for liberation. You can look at shrinking forests, the depleted fisheries, the vanishing wilderness, the rising sea levels, and you can see that the planet is telling us that our existence here is wrong, that we are incompatible with the planetary ecology. The planet is telling us to change or get off, and it will eliminate us if it has to. And I think we're seeing the first signs of the extreme reaction to the human invasion of this planet, the complete colonization of this planet. There are 2 important things we need to focus on that are signs that are utterly unique about this moment we're living in now. It's utterly unique. We can never forget this. Number 1 is the issue of climate change. This is widely debated, but I think the facts are in. And I prefer to err on the side of safety. We have gone from taking over local ecosystems and collapsing them and moving on to different ones and to larger ones, to having taken over the planetary ecosystem such that the entire ecology is now in crisis and is collapsing. There's no place else left to go. This is the 6th, we're in the era of global warming, of planetary climate change. This is utterly unique. We began to speak about this in the 60s and 70s a little bit. It was more of a hypothesis than a reality. Now this is our lived state. This is what we are handing down to our successors. Second, we need to realize that we are in the 6th species extinction crisis in the history of this planet. The 6th. There have been 5 before. They have all been caused by natural events, such as the crashing of a meteor into the Gulf of Mexico. Well, we are this meteor. And we keep crashing and crashing and crashing, and the planet has no chance now to heal. So we are in the 6th species extinction crisis in the history of the planet right now. When was the last one, you might ask? 65 million years ago, when the dinosaurs were eliminated from the planet, and 50% of the species were gone because of a meteoric strike 65 million years ago. That's how unique this era is right now. We should never forget it. Now, so I think it's safe to say that the global capitalized world is inherently destructive. This system cannot be humanized, it cannot be civilized, it cannot be made green-friendly. I think it has to be transcended at all levels through revolutionary thinking and revolutionary politics. It cannot be reformed, it can only be revolutionized. This is our only chance, and if this seems impossible, then our future is impossible. There's been growing awareness in the last 3 decades that we need to unite political movements to make the changes necessary to overcome this catastrophic situation that we're in. And we've seen a lot of activity uniting social movements and green movements, and the Zapatistas and Earth First alliances, and with something called the Environmental Justice Movement in the U.S. There's been a lot of activity uniting social ecology movements together, human rights and the rights of nature. But the left, the humanist left, has apparently ignored an obvious fact that there is a new liberation movement on this planet today. And its insights and its politics have to be integrated into the social and ecological movements. And that movement is the animal liberation movement. And until we integrate these 3 movements together, the movement for human rights, animal rights, and the rights of nature, we have nothing. And it's no movement I want to be a part of. We have to fight for it all. We don't fight for anything. It will all come together. It all hangs together. It all fall apart as one. So we need to bring these 2 movements together, or these 3 movements together. And there's been very little activity about this so far. And I feel like I'm trying to bring together a warring family that hates each other, and they don't want to come together when I talk about the social liberation movements and the animal liberation movements. When I know that unless these movements come together, we have no chance. I know this. And this is something I deeply believe in. So I think that the left has to acknowledge the validity of the animal liberation movement for 2 reasons. One, the moral reason. You cannot talk about peace and justice. You cannot pretend to have compassion. You cannot have any pretense to enlightenment if you think that the Holocaust of life on this planet right now is of such trivial significance that you can eat animals as you talk about peace. That we can murder animals daily in our lives and pretend that we're civilized and enlightened. This has to stop. This hypocrisy, this pretension. I say this 30 years as a vegetarian, 20 years as a vegan. We cannot talk about rights and ecology. We cannot talk about peace and nonviolence so long as our daily lives are predicated upon the extermination of species or the mass manufacturing of suffering. This has to end. We must become consistent in our values and our thinking and in our lives. We must become part of the solution and not a part of the problem. So the left has to recognize this morally and has to recognize this practically, that we must come together in new forms of alliances. So what I've been calling for are new visions, new alliances, new kinds of politics, new forms of dialogues that should have never been attempted. Bring the left together and the animal liberation movement together so that the left stops mocking and trivializing these issues and the animal liberation movement, which is the animal welfare movement, the animal rights movement, and the radical liberation movement itself. Such that they stop pretending to be single issue. They stop pretending that we can liberate animals without liberating humans, without liberating the earth at the same time. So each movement has a problem, just speaking of the human liberation movement and the animal liberation movement. But the solutions to their problems are by coming together and forging alliances and merging their various insights and the contributions of their politics. So I talk about a politics of total liberation. And by total liberation, I don't mean we become totally free someday. Imagine all kinds of problems will exist in a revolutionary society. I talk about total liberation in the sense that the earth, animal, and human liberation movements need to come together. We need to make one systemic fight against oppression. The enemy on the planet is oppression. It's not just capital. It's oppression. Racism, sexism, homophobia, speciesism, all these things, when I argue today, they stem from some basic cores, some flaws in human thinking and human society that I believe that we can change. We need first what I'll call for a multi-perspectival theory of power. We'll see some things about power and domination, and then an alliance politics. And these are how the theoretical and political components of this vision I'm advocating come together with a multi-perspectival theory of power and a strategic theory of political alliances. The theoretical and the political components are one. When we talk about power, we are talking about, notice, not class. Class is not the problem. The problem is hierarchy. The problem is institutionalized networks of domination where one group thinks itself superior to another group, and at first thinks this, and then it enacts this in brutal systems of domination and violence. And so racism, sexism, homophobia, speciesism, anthropocentrism, they all have something in common. They all flow from the same institutional psychological networks of hierarchy. So our problem is hierarchy. And you can look, for instance, at the Marxist argument that the domination of nature led to the domination of human beings. You can look at the anarchist argument, such as von Murray Bookchin, and say that no, the domination of humans leads to the domination of nature. It's the other way around. And you can look, for instance, at the various kinds of history we've tried to write. Theological history, humanist history, recently environmental determinist history, that we can only understand the dynamics of history from God or from human activities such as Marx has analyzed, and then from the environment, the extreme importance of how the environment has shaped human history. Right? We can believe, I think, that God is not shaping human history, we are shaping our own history. Then we begin to realize how the environment is shaping our history in incredibly powerful ways that we're only beginning to understand. Well, what we now need to recognize is what I'm going to call shaping history from the animal standpoint. We have to grasp what I call the animal standpoint. The animal standpoint is understanding the problems in our society, the problems in our psyche, as they flow from our relationship to animals. And when I talk about the animal standpoint, I'm not pretending as if animals can speak, although I think they're speaking to us today, as I think the earth is speaking to us today in their languages. What I mean is that we look at how the crises in our society and psychology flow from our relationship to animals, and that the domination of human over animal, over other animals, has led to the domination of human over human, and the domination of human over the earth. In other words, our relationship to animals is at the core of all these crises in the planet and in our minds. And unless we begin to resolve this, unless we address issues such as animal liberation and veganism, we don't have a chance. This is my argument, and I hope you're open-minded to hearing it. So, the most decisive revolution that occurred in history, many theorists argue, was not the capitalist revolution, the industrial revolution. It began much earlier in history. It really set the framework for even that. And this revolution was the agricultural revolution. This began some 10 to 15,000 years ago. And it began in a shift from living nomadic tribes or bands of human beings, hunting-gathering tribal societies. The shift from that to settled agricultural society, where we began to farm, we began to cultivate animals, we began to cultivate plants. We began, in other words, the domestication of life. We began to domesticate the planet and to domesticate animals. This shift was utterly profound and is at the core of so many problems that we have today, because I think as a result of beginning to domesticate life and using it for our purposes and pretending that we have control over the living world, we began to develop what I call the dominator worldview. That other things exist for our purposes to dominate. These other things could be the planet, it could be other species, it could be other peoples. But from the dominator worldview or standpoint, we see everything instrumentally. We see everything hierarchically. And you notice the problem with our societies. The problem with our societies is we can't understand difference without organizing as hierarchy. We can't understand difference for its own sake. We have to somehow create this in a framework where we see everything in terms of superior and inferior. This is a disease. We had a dominator worldview, and this is how it works. I'll try to describe this in very simple terms. Animals were put in what I call the moral basement. The moral basement, you have a category of beings that don't matter, that mean nothing to us in life. So once we have this category created, the moral basement, all we gotta do, like with your computer, you drag an icon into a trash bin. You just take whole categories of people and you put them down there in the moral basement. Take women, take slaves, take people of color, islanders. You take all the beings that Western European culture denigrated as inferior. There's already a preset category for this. They're already the instruments of domination for this. They came from our domination of animals. Our identity, clearly, as Homo sapiens sapiens, was formulated in distinguishing ourselves from the natural world and from other species. From realizing that they are not rational and we are rational, and we distinguish ourselves, we define ourselves as rational beings in opposition to other animals. And of course the revolution today, called cognitive ethology, is telling us that we are the non-rational beings. They have intense sophistication to their lives and their cultures. And then in every way we've tried to distinguish ourselves from animals. This has proved to be false. That we know nothing yet about other animals. We're just beginning to learn. We're still in the dark ages of understanding other species, and therefore of understanding ourselves. And it's just now, as we turn we make this turn in history toward utter collapse and catastrophe. Ironically, it's just now we're beginning to understand who we are. And so the conceptual framework for domination was provided by distinguishing ourselves as superior to other forms of life, and by defining the main characteristic of value as rationality. Specifically, male rationality, specifically male European rationality, was defined by opposition to our relationship to animals that began all the way back, maybe millions of years ago. Began thinking in terms of opposition and no longer just difference. So, sexism and racism can easily be linked to speciesism, and we can go much further than this. We can look, for instance, at colonialism. And every time one species dominates another, there's always the vilification, the demonization of this species as an animal. They are insects, they are rats, they are mice, they are vermin, they are mere animals. And so the animal model is there. And before there's sword play, first there's word play. Before we start the killing, first we start the defining. And the defining is used from the animal model. We reduce them to animals. We take people and put them in the moral basement. And that's where we slice them apart. And there's no morality to this, because this is we have no moral obligations to animal-like people, to anyone that fits outside the standard male Western European dominator model. We slice them apart. There's absolutely no ethics to this. They're mere things. How can there be ethics to this? They're things.
Mr. Best, you mentioned in your speech about the animal standpoint. Do you believe that it will change the way, as humans, it will change the way we see and treat the animals? It will be a nice example for the end of the exploitation from human by human.
The animal standpoint is absolutely essential for understanding history, understanding social evolution, understanding the crisis of the planet today, right now. Marx spoke about the riddle of history. Communism answers the riddle of history. Well, communism doesn't answer the riddle of history. No one standpoint answers the riddle of history. The riddle of history, to me, is how did this crisis evolve? How do we become a dominator society? We once were an egalitarian society. So we have to understand this transition and what happened to our social networks and our mindset that became hierarchical. Now, the animal standpoint is absolutely essential for understanding the causes and evolution of hierarchy and crisis, the social and ecological crisis we have today on the planet. It cannot be understood without the animal standpoint. We need many standpoints, but it's absolutely crucial. And so far, it's been largely neglected. So I don't think we have much of a chance, both theoretically to understand what's happening and politically to change it.
Do you think that the human, animal, and earth liberations, which are linked in an holistic way, is first of all a matter of political issue?
Yeah, it's first of all a matter of understanding the commonalities of oppression, how different systems of power overlap. And you can't fight sexism or racism without fighting speciesism and contrary-wise. So total liberation tries to unite these standpoints. Now, actually, I'm somewhat pessimistic about the possibilities of total liberation because our mindset is tribal, and people have a very hard time working together. It's hard to have a relationship sometimes with one person, let alone to build an effective movement, let alone to unite many movements with different interests, although common interests if they were to see. It's very difficult to build such a politics. I know that there have been examples in history of people successfully doing this. The emergence of alliance politics in the U.S. in the 19th century is one example. The child's reform movement, the women's reform movement, the animal reform movement, the black abolitionist slave movement. People, they worked in and out of these movements together. They are often working together. So there is a possibility, and there are many other examples, but there is a possibility of forming alliance politics. And we absolutely must. But so far I just see tribalism. And as I said, we have integrated ecology with social justice. We've got to get animal liberation into that. That means that the animal liberation community needs to see that they can't be single issue. They have to confront the racism, sexism in their own movement. And that the left movement has to take the animal liberation movement seriously. It has to see veganism as key to the solution to the environmental crisis.
The social movement will be the key in order to persuade all the poor people, all the lower classes of the world to adapt a new vision about ecology. Is the social movement the key?
The social movement is the key because that means we don't just make personal change in our lives. So this is against the idea, for instance, of lifestyle veganism, and all I can or should do is just become a vegan in my life. No, I'm sorry. You have to fight for social justice and fight for the environment. Not enough just to make the changes in your life, you have to become a part of a movement. You need to build a movement. We can't have people fragmented from one another, building their private utopias. We work together, we build bridges with one another toward common goals, liberation goals, and we respect one another's needs. But you see, moral progress comes through social movements. It doesn't just come through the visions of individuals. It has to be built into a social movement. That's how change happens.
And the last question, the social movement progress will be come from the civil society or from the current political status?
The movements will come from within civil society. The liberation movements. I'm not so trustworthy of the state. I forget the state providing the solution. The NGOs have sometimes developed their own power dynamics. So I see the answer to lie in populist struggles and people struggles, democracy from below, and maybe globalization from below, not imposed from above, but through the democratization of social movements. And we can't have democracy of social movements so long as we take the animal liberation, put it in the back seat of change. So the animal liberation movement has to be up in the front seat helping to drive this revolution because the insights and the politics from the animal standpoint are too critical.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.